Income Without Peace by Wealthy Mindset Audiobooks. You have built a life that, by every measurable standard, represents progress, and yet something quiet and unnamed continues to press down on you, surviving every raise, outlasting every milestone, refusing to dissolve with the arrival of each new level of success. The problem, it turns out, is not that you haven't earned enough. It is that the framework you were handed to think about money was never designed to produce the one thing you were actually seeking. This audiobook is not about earning more. It is about understanding, with clarity and without judgment, why income and peace occupy fundamentally different categories, and what it genuinely takes to build the second from the first. By the end, the confusion that made the stress feel permanent will have been replaced by something more useful than motivation. It will have been replaced by understanding. And understanding, applied quietly and consistently, is the only thing that ever actually holds. There is a particular kind of success that doesn't feel the way it was supposed to. Not failure, not crisis, not the kind of struggle that has a clear address or a visible cause. This is something quieter, a low, persistent hum that follows you into the mornings, sits with you at your desk, and somehow survives every raise, every promotion, every milestone you once believed would finally silence it. You are earning more than your parents did at your age. That is not a small thing. For many people listening to this, that sentence represents years of sacrifice, of delayed gratification, of choices made carefully and sometimes painfully. You have built something real. The numbers confirm it. And yet, if you sit quietly for long enough, away from the noise of the workday, away from the momentum of ambition, something honest surfaces, a tension you cannot quite name, a weight that the income was supposed to lift and didn't. This is where most people go silent, because naming this feeling out loud carries a kind of risk. It sounds ungrateful. It sounds like complaining from a position of comfort, which is its own form of social embarrassment. And so the feeling gets filed away, dismissed as stress, attributed to a busy season, or quietly blamed on a personality that simply isn't wired for contentment. You tell yourself you'll feel better when the next thing arrives, the next raise, the next role, the next number in the account that finally feels like enough. But the next thing arrived, and the feeling remained. What changed was its texture. Early financial anxiety is raw and obvious. It has the sharp edge of a real and present threat. But this version is different. It is more polished, more sophisticated. It no longer announces itself in dramatic terms. It simply occupies the background of your life like a noise you've stopped consciously hearing, but that is shaping your mood nonetheless. You go to dinner at a restaurant you could not have afforded 5 years ago, and somewhere beneath the enjoyment is a faint, irrational tightness. You check the account not because the balance is dangerous, but because something in you needs the reassurance, and the reassurance lasts about as long as closing the app. This is the stress of someone who is succeeding, and that distinction matters more than it might appear on the surface. The stress of scarcity and the stress of success feel different from the inside, but look similar from the outside. And, more importantly, they require entirely different responses. When money is genuinely insufficient, the problem is mathematical. You add income, you reduce the problem. The logic is clean. But you have already added income repeatedly, and the logic hasn't held, which means you have been applying a mathematical solution to something that was never, at its root, a mathematical problem. Morgan Housel wrote that wealth is what you don't see, And there is a layer beneath that observation that most people never reach. What you also don't see is the psychological architecture that determines whether earned wealth translates into felt security. That architecture is invisible. It was never included in the curriculum of ambition you were handed. And its absence is not a personal failing. It is a structural gap that looks, from the inside, like a character flaw. So you work harder, you earn more, you assume the threshold is just ahead, and the people around you, earning similar amounts, living similar lives, appear to be fine, or at least they appear to be fine, which makes the silence feel more personal, more specific to you, more indicative of some deficiency in your relationship to money or happiness or gratitude. You start to wonder if you are simply not built for contentment, if something in your wiring is misaligned, if everyone else received an instruction manual you somehow missed, they didn't, and you're not broken. What is actually happening is both simpler and more significant than a character flaw. You were handed a framework for thinking about money, absorbed through observation, through culture, through the financial behavior of every household you grew up watching. And that framework was built entirely around one idea: earn more, and the rest will follow. It was a reasonable framework for a different problem. For the problem of scarcity, it works. For the problem you are now living inside, it is the wrong map entirely. And here is the quiet, unsettling recognition that this section is really building toward. The discomfort you carry is not evidence that you have failed to earn enough. It is evidence that you have been navigating a landscape that income alone was never equipped to resolve. The framework failed you, not the other way around. That realization doesn't solve everything, but it changes where to look. And sometimes, looking in the right direction is the only thing that needed to happen first. The mind is very good at learning the wrong lesson from the right experience. When money is genuinely scarce, when the account balance determines whether the lights stay on, when the end of the month arrives before the end of the paycheck, the stress is immediate, specific, and correctly diagnosed. In that environment, more income is the answer. It addresses the problem directly, the way water addresses thirst, and the relief that follows is real. The brain registers it, files it, and draws a clean conclusion. Financial stress is a quantity problem. Earn more, worry less. The lesson feels earned because in that moment it was. The trouble is what happens next. That lesson gets carried forward, not examined, not questioned, simply carried into an entirely different financial environment. And because the lesson once worked, it feels reliable. It has the weight of personal experience behind it. So, when the new level of earning still produces stress, the instinct is not to question the lesson. The instinct is to assume the level isn't high enough yet, that the threshold is just ahead, that the equation still holds, and the variable simply needs more time to catch up. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is the natural behavior of a mind that learns something true and doesn't yet know it has outgrown it. Consider a traveler navigating through an unfamiliar region. They have a map, detailed, clearly labeled, professionally produced. They consult it confidently. But the map was drawn for a different city, in a different country, with different roads entirely. The traveler is not lost because they lack a map. They are lost because they are using the wrong one. And the more confident they are in the map, the longer it takes to consider that the map itself might be the problem. This is precisely what happens when a framework built for scarcity gets applied to a life that has moved well beyond it. The hidden cost of this misdiagnosis is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself as a mistake. It accumulates quietly over years in the form of misdirected effort. Every raise becomes a new version of the same hope. Every promotion carries the same implicit promise that this time the relief will be lasting. And when it isn't, the response is almost never to question the framework. It is to work harder within it. To earn more, spend a little more, save roughly the same amount, and wait for the feeling that never quite arrives. A decade can pass this way. 15 years. An entire career of forward motion that somehow never closes the distance to the thing being sought. What makes this particularly costly is what happens psychologically when a solution keeps failing. In most areas of life, when something stops working, we adjust the approach. But financial stress carries a layer of shame that makes honest examination difficult. When the prescribed solution, earn more, repeatedly fails to deliver peace, the most natural and most damaging conclusion is a personal one. That the problem is not the strategy, but the person. That others are managing their relationship to money with an ease that seems unavailable to you. That something in your character, your discipline, your gratitude, your fundamental wiring is the variable that needs correcting. This is where the misdiagnosis does its deepest damage, not in the bank account, but in the story the person begins to tell about themselves. James Clear observed that every action you take is a vote for the type of person you wish to become, but the inverse is also quietly true. Every repeated failure to feel financially secure, when filtered through a flawed diagnosis, becomes a vote for a story of personal inadequacy. And that story, once it takes root, starts to shape decisions in ways that compound the original problem. The most important thing to understand about a misdiagnosis is that it doesn't feel like one. It feels like perseverance. It feels like patience. It feels like trusting the process, staying the course, believing that effort will eventually be rewarded with the peace it was supposed to produce. From the inside, there is no obvious signal that the framework is wrong, only the quiet, persistent feeling that something isn't adding up, which then gets attributed to something personal rather than something structural. And so the real work, the work that no raise can do on its behalf, is not to earn more within the existing framework. It is to examine the framework itself, to ask, with genuine curiosity and without self-blame, whether the map being used was ever drawn for this particular terrain. That question is not a small one, but it is the correct one. And the willingness to ask it, to sit with the discomfort of not yet having the answer, is the first movement away from a decade of solving the wrong problem towards something that might finally hold. The pattern doesn't arrive with a warning. It doesn't feel like a mistake when it begins, because in the beginning, it isn't one. When income rises for the first time in a meaningful way, the adjustments that follow feel entirely proportionate. A better apartment makes sense. The old one was genuinely too small or too far or too worn at the edges. A newer car makes sense. Reliability matters. And you've earned a degree of comfort after years of making do. The nicer restaurants, the upgraded phone, the weekend away that you'd been postponing for 2 years. Each of these feels not like indulgence, but like arrival, like the natural and reasonable rewards of a life being lived correctly. And because each decision is justifiable on its own terms, none of them feel like a pattern. They feel like progress. This is precisely what makes the pattern so difficult to see. What is actually happening beneath the surface of these individually reasonable choices is that expectation is quietly expanding in lockstep with income, not dramatically, not recklessly, but consistently, reliably, and in a direction that ensures the distance between what you earn and what you feel financially secure about remains remarkably stable. The number in the paycheck grows. The number required to feel comfortable grows with it. And the gap, the space where accumulation was supposed to happen, where the architecture of actual financial security was supposed to be built, stays roughly the same size it was when you earned considerably less. What never expands at the same pace is structure. Not the structure of a budget in the rigid, punishing sense that word often implies, but the quiet, intentional infrastructure of a financial life that knows what it is building toward. Where surplus goes before lifestyle claims it. What the money is doing between the earning and the spending. These questions, which matter enormously to the long-term feeling of financial security, get crowded out by the momentum of a life that is visibly improving and therefore feels like it must be moving in the right direction. Here is the contradiction that most people never pause long enough to confront. The more disciplined and ambitious the person, the more effectively this pattern operates. A person who works hard, earns consistently, and makes thoughtful individual decisions is also a person who funds their lifestyle upgrades very efficiently. They meet every commitment. They justify every expense. They are, in the conventional sense, doing everything right. And yet they are compounding not wealth, but the appearance of it, building a life that looks, from the outside, like financial success, while the internal experience remains one of quiet, low-grade anxiety that never quite resolves. Intelligence does not protect against this. If anything, it deepens the trap. A sharp, capable mind is extraordinarily good at constructing justifications for individual decisions. It can produce, on demand, a reasonable argument for almost any expense. And it does, because the expense usually is reasonable in isolation. What the sharp mind is less naturally inclined to do is step back far enough to examine the whole. To ask not whether this particular decision makes sense, but whether the accumulated pattern of decisions is building something or simply sustaining an ever more expensive version of the same financial position. Charlie Munger once observed that it's not supposed to be easy. Anyone who finds it easy is stupid. He was speaking about investing, but the observation lands with equal precision here. The reason this pattern persists in the lives of capable, educated, hardworking people is not that it is obvious and ignored. It is that it is genuinely difficult to see from the inside. It disguises itself as progress. The apartment is nicer. The wardrobe is better. The opportunities available to you are larger than they were 3 years ago. Every visible signal says things are improving. And they are improving, just not in the direction that produces the feeling you are actually seeking. Perhaps the clearest moment of recognition comes at the end of a genuinely good earning month. The paycheck was solid. There were no emergencies, no unusual expenses, nothing that would explain a shortfall. And yet, when you check the account, the number is smaller than it should be, and you cannot fully account for where it went. Not because you were careless, but because the pattern is faster than the awareness. And it has been running quietly in the background long enough to feel like the natural order of things. This is the invisible pattern, not a moral failing, not a lack of discipline, a structural absence that lifestyle has filled by default because intentional structure was never put in its place first. Seeing it clearly, without judgment, is the beginning of something different, not a correction, a reorientation, the kind that changes not just what you do with money, but what you understand it to be doing with you. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep doesn't fix. It is not the exhaustion that follows a hard week of work, the kind that yields to a quiet weekend and arrives Monday morning at least partially restored. This tiredness is different in quality. It is the fatigue that accumulates when effort is consistent and genuine, when the work is real and the results are visible, and yet the internal experience of progress remains stubbornly, confusingly flat. You are moving. You can prove it. The titles have changed. The income has grown. The life by every external measure has improved. And still, most mornings, something in you feels like it has been running for a very long time without closing the distance to wherever it was supposed to arrive. This is the emotional weight of the invisible pattern. Not dramatic, not the kind of suffering that earns sympathy or demands attention. Simply a persistent, low-grade exhaustion that comes from operating inside a contradiction you haven't yet named. From the outside, the life looks right. This is part of what makes the experience so isolating. The apartment is comfortable. The career is advancing. The income is real and documented and growing. There is nothing, from any external vantage point, that would explain the unease. And so, the unease becomes a private matter, something managed quietly, attributed to personality or temperament, or the vague sense that you are simply not someone who relaxes easily. The gap between how the life appears and how it feels becomes its own source of confusion. Because if everything looks fine and you still don't feel fine, the most available conclusion is that something is wrong with you. Consider someone who spent years working toward a salary that once felt like it would change everything. And when it arrived, it did change things for a while. There was a period, perhaps a few weeks, when the number felt genuinely significant. When checking the account carried a lightness it hadn't before. When the quiet pride of having reached something real was available and warm and present. But by the fourth month, the number had become the new normal. The lifestyle had adjusted to meet it, and a new threshold had already installed itself somewhere just ahead, not chosen consciously, not announced, simply arrived, the way the next item on a list appears the moment the current one is crossed off. The anxiety didn't leave, it relocated. The long-term cost of living inside this cycle is not ruin. It is something subtler and in some ways more significant. A life lived persistently below its own capacity for peace. A person who possesses, objectively, everything required to feel financially secure, and who cannot access that security, is experiencing a particular kind of loss that rarely gets named because it doesn't look like loss from the outside. It looks like success, which means the grief of it, if that word is not too large, goes unmourned and unaddressed. What erodes quietly in this environment is confidence, not the professional kind that often remains intact, even grows, but the private, financial confidence that allows a person to look clearly at their own numbers, to have honest conversations about money with the people they love, to make decisions from a place of steadiness rather than anxiety. That confidence thins slowly in the small daily moments of avoidance. The account not checked because checking it feels heavier than not knowing. The conversation about savings or investment or long-term planning postponed again because the topic carries too much unresolved weight. The purchase made not because it was wanted or needed, but because spending in the moment offers a brief and reliable reduction in tension until it doesn't, and the tension returns slightly larger than before. This is where the anxiety stops being merely uncomfortable and becomes genuinely costly. Decisions made from a place of financial unease are different decisions than those made from clarity and confidence. They are more cautious where caution isn't warranted, more avoidant where engagement is exactly what the situation requires. A person earning well but operating under persistent financial anxiety will make smaller bets on themselves, stay longer in circumstances they've outgrown, and consistently underestimate what their actual financial position would allow, because the emotional experience of scarcity has outlasted the material reality of it. And beneath all of this, rarely spoken aloud but present in some form for almost everyone living inside this pattern, is a question that deserves to finally be heard directly. If I am doing everything I was supposed to do, working hard, earning more, building a life that looks successful from every angle, why doesn't it feel like enough? That question is not ingratitude. It is not weakness. It is, in fact, the most accurate and important question available, because the answer to it is not found by earning more. It is found by understanding, clearly and without flinching, what enough was always supposed to be building, and why, until now, no one ever quite explained the difference. Something shifts when you stop blaming yourself for a problem that was never yours to carry alone. Not dramatically, not with the sudden relief of a burden dropped all at once. It shifts the way understanding always shifts, gradually, then completely, like a room coming into focus as your eyes adjust to the light. And what comes into focus, when you finally allow it to, is a distinction so simple that it is easy to dismiss, and so fundamental that missing it explains nearly everything that has felt confusing until now. Peace and income are not the same category of thing. Income is a quantity. It can be measured, compared, increased, tracked on a graph that moves reliably upward with sufficient effort and time. It responds to inputs: work more, earn more, develop a skill, increase the rate. The relationship between effort and outcome, while not perfectly linear, is at least navigable. Income is the kind of problem that yields to intelligence and discipline, which is precisely why intelligent and disciplined people pursue it with such confidence. Peace is something else entirely. It is not a quantity. It cannot be accumulated the way a balance accumulates. It is, at its core, a relationship. Specifically, the relationship between what you have and what you believe it means, between what you earn and what you understand it to be building. And relationships, as every person who has tried to improve one through sheer force of will already knows, do not respond to quantity alone. You cannot buy your way into a healthy relationship. You cannot earn your way into a secure one. The quality of a relationship is determined not by the resources brought to it, but by the understanding operating beneath it. This is the distinction that changes everything, and it is the one that the framework most people inherit never quite makes. The moving goalpost, that familiar, exhausting phenomenon of reaching a threshold only to find the threshold has relocated, is not a personal flaw. It is a design feature of the framework itself. The framework was built on the premise that more is the direction of better, which means it has no natural stopping point, no internal mechanism for sufficiency. A framework without a concept of enough will always produce a horizon that recedes, and a person running toward a receding horizon will always feel, no matter how fast they run, like they are not quite there yet. The exhaustion is not weakness. It is the inevitable result of a pursuit that was structurally designed to remain just out of reach. When that is understood, truly understood, not just intellectually acknowledged, but felt as a release of something that had been held too long, the running slows. Not because ambition does, but because the ambition finally has a more accurate target. Old navigators crossing open water without the aid of satellites or reliable landmarks used a method called dead reckoning. When the stars were hidden and the coastline was gone, and there was nothing external to orient by, they calculated their position from what they already knew: the speed of the vessel, the direction of travel, the hours elapsed since the last known point. It was an imperfect method. It accumulated small errors over time, but it was infinitely more reliable than simply drifting and hoping the current would deliver them somewhere useful. Dead reckoning required intention. It required a navigator who understood that movement without direction is not progress. It is simply motion. Most people who are financially anxious, despite earning well, are not lacking ambition. They are lacking navigation. They were taught, with great thoroughness, how to increase the speed of the vessel. They were never taught to ask where it was pointed, and so the speed increases, the income grows, and the drift becomes more expensive, not because the person is failing, but because effort without direction compounds the distance from the destination rather than closing it. The reframe, when it arrives, is quiet. It does not announce itself with fanfare. It simply settles, a shift in how the anxiety is interpreted. The unease you have been carrying is not evidence that you are behind. It is not a signal of personal inadequacy or financial incompetence. It is the signal of a capable person operating inside a framework that was never designed to produce the thing they were actually seeking. And what you were seeking, beneath every raise and every promotion and every milestone that briefly satisfied and then receded, was never the number itself. It was solidity, the feeling of ground that holds, the quiet certainty that tomorrow would not require the same exhausting vigilance as today. That is a legitimate thing to want. It is, in fact, the most reasonable financial desire a person can have, and it is entirely buildable, not through more income, but through a fundamentally different relationship with the income already arriving. When that realization lands, something changes in what feels possible, not just in what you think about money, but in what you believe you are allowed to build with it. And that belief, quietly revised, is where everything that follows begins. The most meaningful changes don't feel like changes when they begin. They feel like clarity, like something that was always slightly out of focus, quietly sharpening into resolution. There is no dramatic decision, no single moment of resolve that divides the before from the after. There is simply a morning, or an ordinary Tuesday, or a quiet moment between one task and the next, when you realize that you are thinking about money differently than you were before. Not because you were instructed to, because something beneath the thinking has shifted and the thoughts are following. This is what happens when a framework loses its invisible authority. Until it is seen, a framework operates the way gravity operates, shaping every movement without announcing itself, so constant and so complete that its influence never rises to the level of conscious examination. You don't question gravity, you simply build your entire physical experience around its presence. The financial framework most people inherit works precisely this way. It shapes every expectation, every measure of progress, every interpretation of what the money means. And because it does this invisibly, from beneath the level of deliberate thought, It is never examined, never chosen, never updated to match the life it is supposedly serving. But once it is seen, something irreversible happens. You cannot unsee a framework any more than you can unknow a fact. And the moment it becomes visible, the moment you recognize that the goalpost was always designed to move, that the anxiety was never evidence of personal failure, that income and peace have always occupied different categories of experience, the framework loses the power that invisibility gave it. It can no longer direct behavior from beneath conscious awareness because it is no longer beneath conscious awareness. It is simply one way of thinking about money. And now, there are others. What shifts first is identity. Not loudly, not with ceremony, but in the quiet reclassification of what kind of person you are in relation to money. The shift is from someone who earns and hopes, who works hard, receives income, and trusts that the feeling of security will eventually arrive on its own, to someone who earns and builds. The distinction sounds small. It is, in practice, total, because the person who earns and hopes is always waiting for an external condition to deliver an internal experience, and the person who earns and builds understands that the internal experience is constructed deliberately from the decisions made between the earning and the spending. With that shift comes something unexpected. The comparison to others, that persistent, exhausting habit of measuring your financial position against the visible lives of people around you, begins to lose its grip, not through an act of will, not by deciding to care less, but because the measuring stick itself has been exposed as inaccurate. Comparison was only compelling when the framework said that more was the direction of better and that others were a reasonable proxy for how far along that direction you had traveled. Once you know what you are actually building toward, once the destination is yours, chosen, specific, other people's financial lives become genuinely less relevant. Not dismissively, but practically. They are navigating towards something different, with a different vessel, on a different timeline. Their position tells you nothing useful about yours. What begins to emerge, in place of comparison and avoidance and the low hum of unexamined anxiety, is something closer to curiosity. The same person, earning the same income, begins to look at money as a material, not a reward to be consumed as quickly as it arrives, not a score to be compared against others, but something with properties, something that can be shaped, directed, given intention. The question stops being how much and starts being toward what. And that question, asked consistently, reorganizes financial behavior more reliably than any instruction ever could. Structure, in this light, stops feeling like restriction. This is perhaps the most practically significant shift of all. The decision to know where money goes, to give it direction before lifestyle claims it by default, stops carrying the connotation of discipline as deprivation. It begins to feel, instead, like an act of care. Care for a future version of yourself who deserves to inherit something more solid than the anxiety that funded a comfortable but structurally unexamined present. As James Clear observed, every action is a vote for the person you are becoming. Choosing to know where your money goes is a vote, cast quietly and repeatedly, for a self who lives without the background hum. Avoidance becomes curiosity. Anxiety becomes information, a signal pointing somewhere specific rather than a weather system to endure. And the drift, which was never chosen, but simply happened in the absence of direction, begins to resolve into something that feels, for the first time in a long time, like genuine forward movement. Not because anything external has changed, because the person looking at it has. Insight without application is just a more sophisticated form of confusion. It feels better than confusion. It has the texture of progress. The warmth of understanding finally arrived. But understanding that doesn't eventually touch behavior remains, in the most practical sense, decorative. What matters now is not whether the framework has been seen clearly, but whether the seeing begins to change what happens on an ordinary Wednesday, in the small and largely unremarkable decisions that constitute the actual architecture of a financial life. And this is where the shift becomes tangible. Under the old awareness, a raise was received in a particular way, not consciously, not with deliberate intention, but reflexively, as an invitation to expand. The apartment could be slightly better now. The car was due for an upgrade. The standard of restaurant that felt like a treat quietly became the standard that felt like the baseline. None of these adjustments were dramatic. Each was, individually, entirely defensible. But collectively, they ensured that the new income level was absorbed almost completely by the new lifestyle level, leaving the structural gap, the space where intentional building was supposed to happen, exactly as wide as it was before the raise arrived. Under the new awareness, a raise arrives differently. It arrives as a question, not a restriction, not a moral injunction to spend less and suffer quietly, but a genuine, open question. What does this make possible that I haven't built yet? That question, asked before the lifestyle has a chance to expand to fill the new space, creates something that was never present before. A pause. A moment of direction before default takes over. And in that pause, however brief, a different kind of decision becomes available. The small decisions, seen through this new lens, reveal themselves for what they have always actually been. The subscription renewed for the 4th consecutive year without conscious thought. The dinner that was justified in the moment and forgotten by the weekend. The transfer to savings that was scheduled for the first of the month and then quietly postponed because something else came up, and then postponed again until the month closed without it. These are not footnotes to a financial life. They are accumulated across 12 months and then across a decade, the actual substance of it. They are the bricks laid daily and largely without awareness that determine what the structure looks like from the inside, whether it holds, whether it creaks, whether it offers the solidity that the income, in theory, was always sufficient to build. The illusion that loses its power most completely, once this is genuinely understood, is the comfortable one that said security and comfort could coexist indefinitely without intention. That the savings would accumulate on their own somehow from what was left over. That the future would be funded by the surplus that never quite materialized because lifestyle always found it first. Comfort now and security later can coexist. This is important to say clearly, because the shift being described is not an argument for deprivation, but they coexist only when they are both chosen, deliberately, before the money finds its own level. Left to its own momentum, money funds the present. It has to be consciously directed to fund the future. Perhaps the most practically clarifying contrast is this. The old pattern was to carry financial anxiety and relieve it through spending. A meal out, a purchase that felt like a reward, a small indulgence that offered genuine, momentary comfort. This pattern is not irrational. It is, in fact, a very human response to discomfort. The problem is not the logic of it, but the arithmetic. Spending to relieve financial anxiety adds to the conditions that produce financial anxiety, which then requires more relief, which produces more spending. The cycle is self-sustaining and invisible from the inside because each individual instance of relief feels like a solution rather than a contribution to the original problem. The new perception simply sees the cycle for what it is, not with judgment, with clarity. And clarity, in this case, is enough to interrupt the automatic quality of the response. The spending doesn't stop entirely. The enjoyment of money doesn't disappear. But the decision is made consciously rather than reflexively, which means it is actually a decision rather than a pattern running unexamined in the background. What begins to emerge as these small recalibrations accumulate is something that cannot be purchased directly, but that income, properly directed, quietly constructs over time. Not wealth in the abstract sense, but the specific, grounded feeling of knowing what your money is doing, of having given it a direction before the month claimed it, of checking an account not with the dread of uncertain arithmetic, but with the steadiness of someone who already knows roughly what they will find. That steadiness, modest, undramatic, entirely unglamorous, is precisely what the anxiety was always pointing toward. It was never out of reach because the income was insufficient. It was out of reach because the intention was absent. And intention, it turns out, costs nothing to introduce. It only requires the decision to ask the question before the answer is made by default. There is a particular relief that comes not from solving a problem, but from finally understanding it correctly. Not the relief of arrival, of having crossed a finish line and earned the right to rest. Something quieter than that. The relief of coherence, of a picture that was fragmented and confusing suddenly resolving into a single, legible image. The pieces were always present. The income was real. The effort was genuine. The desire for security was legitimate and reasonable and entirely human. What was missing was not any of those things. What was missing was the thread that connected them, the understanding that made the whole picture make sense. That thread is now visible, and with it, the person who arrived at the beginning of this audiobook, carrying a stress they could not fully name, is no longer a mystery. Not to themselves, and not to anyone who has followed this journey honestly. Return for a moment to where this began. A person earning more than their parents did, living in a larger space, holding a more impressive title, operating at an income level that a younger version of themselves would have considered genuinely life-changing. And yet carrying, beneath the surface of a life that looked correct from every external angle, a quiet and persistent anxiety that refused to dissolve with the arrival of each new milestone. That person was not broken, was not ungrateful, was not wired incorrectly for contentment. That person was simply operating inside a framework that was built for a different problem and applying, with great diligence and intelligence, a solution that was never designed to reach the thing actually causing the pain. The struggle was never about the income, it was about the gap, the invisible, unexamined space between what arrived each month and what was consciously directed to build something lasting. Income flowed in. Lifestyle absorbed it, naturally and incrementally and with perfect justification at every individual step. Comparison quietly escalated the standard of what felt like enough, and the structural intention that might have directed some portion of those earnings toward genuine felt security. That intention was simply never installed, not through failure of character, but through absence of framework. No one handed it over. And so the anxiety, with nowhere more specific to go, turned inward, became a permanent resident, was interpreted as a personal flaw rather than a structural signal. The philosophy, the emotion, and the behavior, which may have seemed at the start of this like three separate conversations, now form a single coherent picture. The philosophy explains why the goalpost moved. The emotion reveals what that movement cost, quietly and over time, in confidence and clarity and peace. And the behavior shows exactly where the gap between earning and building was maintained, decision by small decision, in the unremarkable daily choices that turn out to be anything but unremarkable in aggregate. These are not three separate problems. They are one problem, seen from three angles, and a problem correctly understood from all its angles is, in the most meaningful sense, already halfway resolved. The elegant takeaways, the one worth carrying forward in its simplest form, is this: peace is not the reward for earning enough. It is the result of understanding clearly what enough is building toward. This distinction sounds subtle. It is, in practice, the difference between a financial life spent waiting and a financial life spent constructing. Between hoping that the next level delivers what the last one didn't, and knowing, with the quiet confidence of someone who has chosen a direction, that the decisions being made today are accumulating into something real. Growth from this understanding does not announce itself dramatically. It does not feel like a transformation from the inside, because it happens in the small, consistent, largely undramatic choices that constitute an ordinary week. A raise received as a question rather than an invitation. A subscription noticed and evaluated rather than renewed by default. A savings transfer made at the beginning of the month rather than funded by whatever remains at the end. None of these actions is remarkable on its own. Together, across months and then years, they are the difference between a financial life that drifts and one that builds. And here is perhaps the most stabilizing truth of all. This kind of growth, once it begins from genuine understanding, is irreversible. Not because willpower is suddenly infinite, or because the old patterns have been permanently erased, but because a person who has seen the framework cannot unsee it. The invisible has been made visible. The unnamed has been named. And awareness, once genuinely established, continues to operate even in the moments when behavior temporarily lapses, because the lapse is now visible too. And visible patterns are patterns that can be returned to and corrected without shame. The person who began this carrying confusion now holds something more durable than a plan. Plans change. Circumstances shift. Specific strategies require revision as life evolves. But perspective, a fundamentally different way of seeing what money is, what anxiety is signaling, and what security actually requires, that does not expire. It applies now, and it will apply to every financial situation that follows, because it operates beneath the specific decisions rather than within them. Perspective, applied consistently and with patience, becomes a life. And that life, built quietly from the inside out, is what income was always capable of supporting. It simply needed to be shown the direction. There is a particular quality to the quiet that follows genuine understanding. It is not the silence of avoidance, the temporary stillness that comes from not looking at something difficult, from closing the app, from changing the subject in your own mind before it settles somewhere uncomfortable. That silence is fragile. It requires maintenance. It depends on keeping certain thoughts at a careful distance, which is its own form of exhausting work. The quiet that follows understanding is different in its texture entirely. It is not maintained. It simply exists, the way a room is naturally still when there is nothing left to disturb it. This is what begins to settle gradually and without ceremony. When the anxiety that has followed you through every income level is finally interpreted correctly. That anxiety was never your enemy. This is worth sitting with because the instinct, for most people who have carried financial stress through years of genuine effort, is to experience that anxiety as an adversary, something to be overcome, silenced, out-earned, something that reflects poorly on the degree to which you have managed your life. But an alarm is not an adversary. An alarm is information in its most insistent form. It persists not because it is broken, but because the message it carries has not yet been received. And the anxiety that followed you into every new income level, that survived every raise and every milestone, was simply a signal, steady, patient, occasionally exhausting, that something in the architecture of your financial life needed attention. Not more income, attention. Now that the signal has been read correctly, it no longer needs to repeat itself at the same volume. This is not suppression, it is resolution. The difference between the two is the difference between holding a door closed against pressure and discovering that the room behind it was never dangerous, only unfamiliar. Once entered, once understood, it loses its weight. The door can simply stand open, and the energy that was spent holding it closed becomes available for something else entirely. What becomes available, perhaps unexpectedly, is patience, not the patience of resignation, of waiting without direction for circumstances to improve on their own, but the patience of someone who understands how things actually compound. Time, applied to intentional decisions, does something that urgency never could. It accumulates, quietly, invisibly, without requiring the constant surveillance and anxiety that characterized the old relationship with money. The person who once needed to check the account repeatedly for reassurance and found the reassurance temporary at best, begins to understand that the steadiness they were seeking was never in the number itself. It was in the relationship to the number, and that relationship, once it stabilizes, requires far less monitoring to maintain. There is something almost meditative in the recognition that you do not need to earn more to begin. The beginning is not contingent on a future income level, a better month, a year that finally cooperates. The beginning is available in the present tense, with the earnings that already arrive, directed with slightly more intention than they were directed before. This is not a small thing dressed up as a large one. It is genuinely, practically true that the distance between a financial life that drifts and one that builds is not primarily a function of how much arrives. It is a function of how clearly the person receiving it understands what it is supposed to be doing. Financial maturity, arrived at from this direction, looks nothing like the confident performance of someone who has never been uncertain. It does not require the pretense that everything is under control or the certainty that nothing will go wrong. It is simply the calm knowledge that the direction is chosen, that the intention is present, that the drift has been replaced by something deliberate. Morgan Housel wrote that the ability to do what you want, when you want, with who you want, for as long as you want, is priceless. And the foundation of that freedom is not a specific number. It is the internal steadiness that comes from no longer being carried by a current you never chose. Self-trust returns in this environment, not loudly, not all at once, but in the small private moments where the old pattern would have produced avoidance, and the new awareness produces something closer to curiosity. The numbers are looked at without dread. The decisions are made with more presence than before. The comparison to others loses the grip it once had, not through discipline but through genuine disinterest, because the measuring stick has been replaced with something that actually fits the life being lived. And rest, real rest, the kind that restores rather than merely pauses, becomes accessible again. Not the rest of someone who has finished, who has arrived at a destination and earned the right to stop, but the rest of someone who knows which direction they are walking, who does not need to solve everything tonight, because tonight's decisions are part of a direction that will still be true tomorrow. Who can set the work down not because it is complete, but because it is held by intention, by structure, by a relationship with money that no longer depends on constant vigilance to remain intact. That is not a small thing to have found. It is, quietly, everything that the anxiety was always asking for. Some truths are simple enough to state in a single sentence and complex enough to take a lifetime to fully inhabit. This is one of them. Income is a resource. Peace is a structure, and one was never designed to automatically become the other. Read that again, not quickly, but slowly enough to feel where it lands. Because somewhere in the gap between those two things, between the resource and the structure, between what arrives and what is built, is where most of the confusion described in this audiobook has quietly lived. Not in the absence of effort, not in the absence of intelligence or ambition or genuine desire for a better life. In the assumption, inherited and unexamined, that the resource, accumulated in sufficient quantity, would eventually construct the structure on its own. That if you earned enough, peace would simply follow, like a shadow follows a body, like warmth follows sunlight, automatically, without additional design. It doesn't. It never did. And the sooner that is understood, not as a discouragement but as a clarification, the sooner the actual work of a financial life can begin. Every generation inherits a definition of financial success. It arrives not through explicit instruction, but through observation, through the financial behavior of every household watched in childhood, every cultural signal absorbed about what success looks like and what it proves about the person who achieves it. And, almost universally, that inherited definition is built around one axis: earning. Earn more, rise higher, reach the next level. The definition is not wrong exactly. Earning matters. Income is the raw material without which nothing else is possible. But it is incomplete in a way that causes immense and unnecessary suffering, because it offers no second axis, no concept of direction, no internal measure of sufficiency, no framework for translating the resource into the structure. The work of a mature financial life, and maturity here has nothing to do with age, and everything to do with the willingness to examine what has been inherited, is to build that second definition. To develop, alongside the capacity to earn, a clarity about what the earning is for, not in the abstract, motivational sense of finding your purpose or defining your why. In the practical, grounded sense of knowing what financial security actually requires in your specific life, what it would feel like to have it, and what decisions, made consistently over time, construct it from the income already arriving. This second definition cannot be borrowed from someone else's life. It cannot be read from a comparison to colleagues or neighbors, or the curated financial narratives that circulate in the spaces where ambition gathers. It has to be chosen, deliberately, from the inside, which is precisely why so few people build it. Not because it is beyond them, but because they were never told it was their responsibility to construct it, and so they waited for the earning to do it for them. Here is the realization that when it arrives, earns its own silence. You were not anxious because you were behind. You were anxious because you were moving fast in a direction you had never consciously chosen. The speed was real. The effort was genuine. The forward motion was measurable and documented and visible to anyone who looked. But direction, the chosen, examined, internally coherent sense of what the motion was building toward, that was never quite established. And a life in motion without a chosen direction produces a very specific feeling. Not failure, not stagnation, something more disorienting than either. The feeling of working very hard and remaining somehow perpetually uncertain about where you are. That uncertainty is over now. Not because the numbers are different, because the understanding is. What remains then is not a call to action delivered with urgency, not a list of things to implement before the feeling fades. What remains is simply this, a truth offered quietly as something to carry forward into every financial decision that follows, large and small, ordinary and significant. The goal was never more money. It was always something quieter, something more human, something that income was always capable of supporting, but never capable of replacing. It was the ability to earn without the low hum of fear running beneath every transaction, to live without the exhausting habit of measuring your position against the lives of people whose destinations you don't actually share, to build slowly, intentionally, without drama or performance, something that holds, something that does not require constant vigilance to remain intact, something that, when you finally stand inside it, feels less like an achievement and more like ground, solid ground, the kind that does not shift with the next income level or collapse under the weight of an unexpected month, the kind that was always available to be built with the earnings already arriving by a person who understood clearly what they were building toward. You are that person now. The building has already begun. There is a particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't require an audience or a dramatic moment of decision. It looks from the outside like simply sitting still long enough to hear something true. But anyone who has tried to do that, to remain present with a question that is uncomfortable, to resist the easier motion of staying busy, of earning more without examining what the earning is for, knows that it requires something real, something that most people, in the rhythm of a full and demanding life, find reasons to defer indefinitely. You didn't defer it. You stayed with the question. And that matters more than it may currently feel like it does. What has shifted in these pages is not primarily behavioral. It is not a collection of techniques or adjustments to be implemented and then evaluated for results. What has shifted is something quieter and more durable than that. A change in what you believe money was ever capable of doing for you on its own. That belief, held invisibly and inherited without examination, was the thing that made the anxiety so persistent and so confusing. It promised that income at sufficient levels would construct peace automatically. And it was wrong. Not maliciously wrong, not carelessly wrong, simply wrong in the way that any incomplete map is wrong, useful up to a point, and then quietly misleading beyond it. That map has been replaced now, not with a perfect one. No map of a human financial life is ever perfect, but with one that is oriented correctly, one that distinguishes between the resource and the structure, between earning and building, between movement and direction. Carry that distinction forward. Not loudly, not with the evangelical energy of someone who has just discovered something they need others to confirm. Quietly, in the private decisions that no one else observes, in the pause before the default takes over, in the question asked of a raise before the lifestyle answers it first, it will change more than you expect, and it will do so without force, without the exhausting requirement of constant willpower, without the performance of discipline that eventually fatigues and collapses. Changed perception changes behavior naturally, the way a river changes course, not through effort, but through the altered shape of the ground beneath it. The ground beneath your financial life has been altered. What flows across it will follow. The ground beneath you, it turns out, was always more solid than the anxiety suggested. That is perhaps the quietest and most important thing to leave with. The anxiety was loud. It was persuasive. It had the weight of years behind it and the daily reinforcement of a culture that measures financial health in ways that were never designed to detect what you were actually missing. But it was not an accurate report on the territory. It was a signal, honest, persistent, occasionally exhausting, that the architecture needed attention. The territory itself, the actual financial life built from years of genuine effort and real income, and decisions that were, most of them, made in good faith, that was never as precarious as the anxiety implied. You are simply learning, finally, to stand on it, to feel the solidity that was there all along, beneath the noise of comparison and the momentum of unexamined expansion and the quiet belief that peace was always one income level away. It was not one income level away. It was one understanding away, and that understanding has now arrived. Go forward from here, not with urgency, but with the steady confidence of someone who has reoriented. The work continues. It always does. But it continues now in a direction that was chosen rather than inherited, toward something that was defined rather than vaguely hoped for. That is not a small thing. In a life, it is very nearly everything. Thank you for staying with this. The question was always worth asking. You were always capable of hearing the answer, and the ground beneath you has been waiting, patiently and without judgment, for you to finally arrive.